Crazy Stupid Podcast.
As always, if this is your first time watching, we'd love it if you could hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell so that you are aware of when we post things.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Crazy Stupid Podcast. We're going to be talking about Dune II today. We are a couple days late posting it. Our bad. We said we were going to post it Saturday.
Bro. Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
like literally the day after we said we were both home from work sick. So
It was rough.
It's honestly, it's still kind of rough. Like, I'm not 100%. So here we are in the midst of our pain.
Oh my gosh. What a fucking movie, bro.
What a movie, for sure.
Oh my God. You know a movie's good when you can feel the ending coming and I'm like, no, please. That's how I felt.
Really?
When the mom was like, he's about to start this holy war, I was like, damn it.
Like you were sad it was good.
Yes, because I was having such a blast just sort of existing in this world. I don't know if I have felt this level of just sort of like fanatical sci-fi escapism to this level like ever.
No, I don't think
Ever.
so. Not to, it's the level and the quality.
Yes.
Combined.
Yeah.
That I don't think we have seen.
Ever.
Yeah, I was going to say in a long time, but like, honestly, I don't think ever. There are certain elements that like other sci-fi films have had. Like, I feel like Avatar definitely gave you that escapism. Obviously, the special effects were very good, but the story was lackluster. Even in the first one was better story-wise than the second one.
Still a very simple story.
But even in the first one, it was like, okay, I know exactly what's going to happen. Like, it's a very predictable story, right? Star Wars, you know, it's fun, it's a good time, it's escapism. I don't think that you can necessarily say that the quality is always consistent. Even the tackling of similar themes is not done as well, with the exception of Andor.
Clone Wars, I will say, it does a good job.
Does a good job as well, but because it's for children,
yeah,
it can't
it's
go,
a little bit softer.
Yeah. Dune, you really get all of it. Like, you get the special effects, you get the escapism, you get the commentary, you get like a really strong narrative.
Yeah.
Just, it has it all. Denis Villeneuve, good on you.
Yo, I remember when you read the little usurp thing at the beginning. I think it was like years ago before the first one came out, when you were like, whoever wrote it was like, we would not get A Song of Ice and Fire or Star Wars or any of these stories without Dune. And so I didn't really know that much about it. Mm-hmm. So when you read that, I was like, whoa. That is a kind of praise that my brain at the time couldn't comprehend that. And then you watch the first one and I'm like, okay, this is good. Then I rewatch the first one. I'm like, all right, no, actually, this is pretty damn good. And then this fucking second one comes out and you're like, yo, this shit is, bro. I've been thinking about this since we watched it. It's been constantly like on my mind. Yes, man. Yeah.
I don't know how Dune was not in my like lexicon before this.
It wasn't.
Because it is like a literary classic. Mm-hmm. Like, as soon as I heard about the film, and I was intrigued because it had Zendaya and Timothée Chalamet, two actors that I very much love and will always support.
Yeah.
So I was like, let me see what this is about. Then I found out like this is actually like a literary classic. Now, I'm sorry I know there's gonna be some Frank Herbert fans that are gonna be like, how could you not know? I'm sorry.
But we hadn't gotten things for like 20, 30 years.
Yeah, but you know like there's like certain books that like it was such a staple.
Everyone should know.
That, you know, when I brought it up to my dad and he immediately was like my dad hadn't read them, but he immediately was like, oh yeah, Frank Herbert. And I was like, oh, that's how I knew. I was like, oh, okay. Like, my dad's a reader. So I was like, okay.
Legend, man. Whoever, I don't remember the name of the person that's a cinematographer. They are winning the Oscar again. They're winning the Oscar.
It was nuts.
1,000%.
It was absolutely nuts.
Oh my God. The first scene with the Harkonnen.
Yeah, I don't know exactly who to give praise for some of the things that I appreciated. But like the design, not just the design of the suits that the Harkonnen wore, but like the design of how they moved through the air and on
like you're on space.
It was very intriguing. Like, I was immediately sitting up. Like, the second that they started lowering, like there was like a weird sense of doom. Like the second they started lowering out of the we should have said this is our spoiler review.
Spoilers.
The second that so many things about it were so visually intriguing, and I don't know exactly who to give props for that, but I never want to take my eyes away from the screen at any point. I was thoroughly invested in everything I was seeing.
There's some shots where my mouth just dropped. I was like,
and all of it, of course, aided by the phenomenal score by Hans Zimmer.
He's a fucking goat, bro.
Just freaking nuts.
If you want a spectacle, if you want a blockbuster film, you bring in Hans, man. Like, I know there's some other big ones that are around, you know, that are sort of on the up and come up right now. Like, I think Ludwig Göransson, phenomenal. Every time Hans come out, he's like, I gotta remind y'all who I am. You know what I'm saying? Like,
he just really knows how to understand the exact tone that a film overall needs to have, because he's very good at setting a thematic tone throughout the entire film, but then also knows how to, within that, provide like the exact vibe for every scene.
And sometimes he does it without a script. When he did Interstellar, I think Nolan only gave him just like a few lines, but he did not have the entire script when he did the music for that.
I'm trying to understand how that works.
Bro, they say he's a genius, and obviously when you hear things like that, it makes complete sense.
Yeah.
The fact that you're able to have a feel of like where the story can go, or have a feel of like what like the ethos of the film is going to like kind of feel like.
We saw it in IMAX also. I will say, like, it was auditorily and visually overwhelming. Not in a bad way, but just in like the whole time I was like, oh my God.
Your senses are on 10 the entire time.
Yeah, it was the scene where Paul rides the sandworm. I was like, oh my God.
And it's like you had a first-person experience, the way that they had the camera shot. It was like you were seeing like the wind and the sand blowing in his face.
Intense.
You felt the danger, all of it.
I also felt this way about the first one. At the end of it, I was like, okay, I understand like that this is meant to be like the intro to this franchise.
Sure.
I think you compared it like to the Batman Begins of the Dark Knight trilogy. They kind of just knew this first one maybe isn't gonna get everybody all excited. It'll get some people, like they knew it was gonna grab some of us, and especially people who had read the books. But I think they knew like this isn't gonna be the big one, but we have to do this one well and set the groundwork well enough so that we can go really big on the second one. And I think that they played their cards exactly right.
And obviously, I mean, I have complete faith in Denis Villeneuve now, but when you rewatch Dune after Dune II, or in close proximity with each other, the first one is actually magnificent. When you start to tie things together, and I'm strictly speaking from someone who has only watched, I haven't fully read the books yet, putting those two things together, even if we didn't get a third one, and we will with the amount of money that we're getting, those two stories is magnificently
phenomenal.
Written and told and acted, and the music is incredible, 100%.
And they were wise to not try to do the whole book in one film. It would have been way too much.
Yeah. And this has been his dream. I remember in an interview where he said when they were kids, they put together a storyboard of the Dune book series, because at one point they were like aspiring to be directors when they were kids.
Wow.
And that was one that he created when he was younger, because he's like, this is it. You know what I mean?
Some of the other things I wanted to touch on before I dived into like the actual plot was just some of the performances.
Oh my gosh. Acting.
The actors and actresses. Zendaya, I think I said this in the like our initial response, but I don't think she really has that many lines in the movie, to be honest. Like, she's very present on screen, but I don't think she actually says that much in the movie. But her emotion, how emotive she is in this film is like memorable. Like, I have been thinking about certain scenes with her, particularly at the end.
The final act. Yeah.
I've been thinking about certain like scenes with her and the way that she portrayed so much emotion without saying anything for a few days. Also, Rebecca Ferguson, absolutely frightening.
Yo, she was horrible.
And it's very interesting actually, because the character is the same. Like, the character is consistent with who her character was in the first film. But somehow in the first film, I trusted her. And she somehow manages in this film to carry over the same consistent character. Like, it's still like a very strong-willed woman, like somebody you don't want to mess with. But somehow in this movie, I like was so distrustful of her. Like, almost immediately. I was like, oh no, like we cannot trust that woman. Also, I think that the fight scenes and the battle scenes in this movie, I think they rival some of the best ones we got in Game of Thrones.
Oh, for sure.
Like, and Game of Thrones, to me, like some of those battle scenes, I was like, I think this is the best
that you could get
that we have ever seen from a battle scene. Because there's something like, you have to make it brutal, but also stylistic. And I think that's a hard balance. And I think Game of Thrones managed to do that a lot. In a lot of their, particularly, Battle of the Bastards.
But even the one-on-ones, there's some key ones that I'm going to always remember. Like when Brienne fights the Hound, I was like, oh, this is this is elite right here that you could get. But then also in Bran's visions, when he sees Ned going to the Tower of the Joy, and then he fights Sir Arthur Dayne and the some of his other Kingsguard. Again, I'm like, this is elite that you can get to. But that fight scene that Paul has with Feyd-Rautha, I was like, yo. And
that one and Feyd-Rautha's like initiation.
Oh yeah, I'll get to that too. Yeah, but even like they didn't do music, and it reminded me of The Dark Knight Rises when Batman faces Bane in that tunnel, where the intensity is sort of brought another level because you can hear everything.
Yeah,
it's such a genius way that not everyone knows how to do it well, because if the choreography isn't brutal enough and there isn't enough dance happening, it can feel kind of cheesy. Hats off to whoever was like the stunt coordinator for that, because I think they should win every award that they can. I mean, you brought up Feyd-Rautha, which I thought was very interesting, because the scene where he's sort of fighting, it's kind of giving like Roman gladiator vibes. And initially, the dynamic that I thought we were going to get between the Baron and Feyd-Rautha was when he says, "Happy birthday, nephew." I thought that was sort of their code that they had, where under normal circumstances, things are protected and sort of skewed and rigged a bit in those fights. Obviously, because he's such an important character in their house. And so when he removes the guardrails, it's like, oh, finally I get a chance to like really compete. And there was some of that. So I thought that when he said, "Happy birthday, nephew," I thought it was like, here's my gift to you, in a very violent and twisted way. Here's your chance to really prove yourself. But that wasn't really to the full extent what I gathered, because he felt betrayed when he had the chance to confront him on that. And so that kind of layer that they added, where like there is complexity to this very psychotic person, I found kind of refreshing, because I didn't want them to go in and then just give me like a Ramsay Bolton where like he's just crazy for being crazy. He had a code which made his character a lot more interesting.
I think he enjoyed the risk and the violence of it. I think he didn't like that he was surprised.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I thought that was interesting. And even with his brother, the one that Dave Bautista plays, he's angry that Bautista failed, because it's like, you brought shame to our house. That was the first thing he said. And then he said, "You brought shame to me." Him naming that feels like, regardless of the brutality and the psychotic nature he has, again, there's like this loyalty there to that house that I don't like necessarily respect, but I can understand that. Like you're adding more layers to who he is and the things that he sort of stands for. I thought they did a good job with him.
I wouldn't be surprised if there was like a lot more of him in the book.
I wouldn't be surprised, yeah.
The way he was introduced to me implied that like this is a character that book readers, people who know about it, are going to be like waiting for his introduction. They hyped him up too. They hyped him up quite a bit, and they chose an actor who's really hot and popular right now.
Very charismatic too.
Honestly, I didn't expect him to die in this movie. I thought Austin Butler, I thought he was going to be in the movies for a while.
Yeah.
He did what he had to do in the film that he had, though. He really ate it up. But I wouldn't be surprised if in the books there must be more of him.
Yeah. Even when he fights, I'm assuming those are captured soldiers from the first battle with Atreides when they fall. He says like, you fought well. There's like this something honorable that he's providing. And then he says the same thing again to Paul at the end.
I mean, I think it's clear he admires strength.
Yes. When it looked like people on the outskirts, their servants were trying to intervene, and he got angry at them. Like, no. And
he wanted to prove that he could do this.
Yes.
I think that is how he measures his own value and how he measures other people's value as well.
Yeah.
Which is bad.
And
that's what he does.
He wasn't the first one chosen. It was Bautista's character that got chosen first to lead that raid of completely, taking over Arrakis. And so like, there's probably a little bit of like a chip on his shoulder of like, all right, now I need to like, I got to prove that I can do this, prove all these people wrong. And like, I don't like him as a character, but I like, you just continue to add more layers to who he is. Makes it more fascinating.
There's also a piece of him that seems like slightly easily manipulated, because that scene with the Bene Gesserit, when she basically seduces him, that didn't feel right at all.
A little predatory. Like, I don't like that.
I feel like he's just like kind of sexually immature.
Yeah.
And like she took advantage of that. To me, me, this movie is a really great argument for why we should be gatekeeping. I don't think that you can call Paul Atreides a cultural appropriator, because it's clear that he engages with Fremen culture with like a sense of respect and honor and genuinely wants to learn about it. Like, he's not removing it from its context. But he is an outsider. And because the Fremen's defenses are down because of the prophecy, they very easily allow him and his mom to engage in like very sacred aspects of their culture to what we know will eventually be their detriment. I was watching the movie like, y'all are letting this white man get a little too comfortable. Like, to me, it's like, I just think it's a great argument for like certain things. It's okay to be like, this is just for us.
Yeah.
Like in the scene where he was like, man, I really want to ride a sandworm, and Zendaya was like, no. I was like, that's right. He should not do that. I was like, that's right. We should not. There should be limits. There should be limits to like what we give him access to. But because they were so wrapped up in this prophecy and who he was and what it would mean if he could do it, they just like trusted him without question. And I will say he did earn some of that trust. I don't think it was completely unearned, but I don't think that they asked enough questions.
But I think you could even make a much harder case with his mom.
His mom, I thought that was very frightening.
The way she infiltrated into spaces where she did not belong into, I thought was extremely dangerous. And they did it very well to intentionally show why it's a problem. When she gets the role of being that Bene Gesserit priest because of the one that passed away, the Reverend Mother, there were people in the room saying that like, yo, we cannot let a foreigner in that space to take up that role. We've never let that happen. It shouldn't change. Even when they were trying to get that holy water from that small sandworm, the woman there who was guarding it was saying that isn't allowed. So even when she's infiltrated that space, she still doesn't have respect for the customs, because she's like, I don't care. I need to give it to my son because I'm convinced he needs to do this thing with this prophecy. So she uses the voice on her and forces her to do the act so that she can give it to Paul.
I would argue even eventually Paul abandons respect for their cultural customs. I'll come back to a little bit later.
Yeah.
Also, he is an outsider in two separate cultural practices, because he is also not supposed to be a part of he's not part of the Bene Gesserit, but he's not supposed to have access to their power either. Like, he's also, and that part was sort of against his will, but I do think it's very notable that like he is a white man and he has been given access to a culture that is meant to be solely for women and a culture that is like predominantly marginalized people of color. And in the end, it's the combination of those two things, his access to both of those spaces that he's not supposed to be in, that allows him to commit like the eventual atrocities that he will commit and be responsible for. In that last scene, in that last act, when he uses the voice, the Bene Gesserit woman who's the truth sayer for the emperor, like, she calls him an abomination.
Yeah.
And I was like, yeah, he kind of is, because he's inhabiting both of these spaces where he really, in my opinion,
doesn't belong,
has no place. And it's awkward because he was given access. He didn't necessarily, I would argue towards the end, he did sort of force his way
with
in.
That speech.
But like, he doesn't necessarily force his way in at the beginning. Like, members of that community give him access, but he ends up abusing that and taking up too much space. And I think that to me is why you gatekeep, because a person who is used to power can be as well-meaning as they want to be. But if you are used to power and you are used to taking up space, when you are given access to something, I think we see this happen time and time again when white people are given access to like black spaces and they end up taking up too much space and too much attention. And part of it is because of the spectacle of this person who we don't expect to be a part of this cultural practice being a part of it. But then I think white people also know that there's going to be that spectacle and they like it. Yeah. That to me is what this reminded me of. Like, part of the reason why it garners all this attention is because of the spectacle and what people think it means, and then he eventually uses that against them. Yeah. And that's always a danger. It could be somebody who will be harmless and won't do anything if you allow them into these spaces, but you can't know that. And so to me, I'm just like, it's okay to just let some things be just for us.
You brought up Paul, and it sort of reminded me of some things that I noticed with him and with his dad, honestly. So I tried to do some research on like, what does Frank Herbert sort of think about when he wrote House Atreides, because there were a lot of people that were like, well, House Atreides in a relative sense were sort of perceived as the good guys because of a level of moral standing that they had, not in general, but only in comparison to the Emperor and the Harkonnens. That's the only thing you're really comparing it to. But when you sort of take a step back, there are a lot of things that House Atreides is a part of in the first film and even in the second one that kind of give off like your sort of classic corporate liberal vibes when you sort of like compare it to the real world. So like the first thing that I sort of thought about is the way that Leto sort of looks at the Fremen, right? When he sees them, he sees this as an opportunity to expand his power and take advantage of this unfortunate circumstance he finds himself in with now being placed on this area. I'm going to make the best out of this because of an injustice that was done to me by the Emperor and try to find a way to sort of monopolize on a resource that isn't really mine, right? Now, granted, he didn't have a choice, but he is still very comfortable in the hierarchy system and having houses. There has been no hint that House Atreides was against any of that. They're contributing to that same problem. Yeah. And I remember there were a couple of quotes that are both in the book and that Frank Herbert said, where he was like, one, scratch a liberal and find a closeted aristocrat, right? So he's trying to show you of like how you need to start looking at House Atreides regardless of how good they may seem as like individual people. And then he also says in a quote, House Atreides acts with the same arrogance toward the common folk as the other houses do. Now, that arrogance is obviously not done through a violent way, but you still see this as we can use what your land offers to benefit us. It's a very telling thing, especially when you look at this second film where again you see Paul, he does not liberate the Fremen. No. Right? He defeats an enemy, one opposer, the Harkonnen, but he does not liberate them. He brings them into their sort of structure, into the fold of this system of houses and him being the emperor and them serving him for his means. Yeah. And it kind of reminded me of that conversation that I remember people having about like making Puerto Rico like a state. You had a lot of liberals that were like, bring them in. And again, very similar to what we saw with Paul at the end of this film with this holy war. Like you had a lot of liberals that were like, this would flip like the electoral college and give us more political capital to get things done for our gain. But you're not really thinking about what they are asking for. Like they're like, we want independency. And it's like that thought didn't even really cross Paul's mind when it's like, I can liberate them and find a way to give them some kind of independency, as opposed to, it's like it didn't even cross his mind. When I get into power, I'm going to use them and they will be a tool that I will use against these other houses.
I think it's pretty clear where his father saw them as a means for power, he saw them as a means for revenge.
Yes.
And I think he does maybe get a little bit conflicted in the middle. As soon as he gets there and his mom and him, like they've entered the Fremen camp and that whole confrontation happened where like some of the people were like murderer. And then they were like, oh, hold up, Lisa Nalgaib. And there's like all of that commotion. And then they're sitting down and they're eating and he's talking to his mom and he says to her, I'm going to need these people to believe in me as this Lisa Nalgaib as the Messiah if I'm going to get revenge. I think that the argument could be made that maybe as he gets to know them and as he falls in love with Chani, that motive maybe falls to the back of his mind, but I don't think it's ever really gone.
No.
I think he's also maybe a little bit deterred by what the fear that comes up from these visions that he has. I don't think he was ever not going to do what he did, personally. I also think it's so clear that there's a conversation that Chani and Paul have where she tells him about how the Fremen value equality.
Yes.
How their culture is one of equality. And you see that in that conversation, he seems very bought into that idea. They have that beautiful moment where he's like, well, I'd love to be equal to you, etc., etc. And I do think that sort of stirs a change of heart because it's after that, I feel like, where you start to see him be push back more against the idea of himself being the Messiah and really trying to buy into this. But eventually what he does is he completely overrides that aspect of their culture and completely envelopes them in this idea of hierarchy. He names himself the Duke of Arrakis and the Duke of the Fremen people, which is not something they don't have that. They don't have dukes. They do have an authority system that we know of because obviously like Stilgar was considered a leader. But they also show us over and over again in the films how much they value dissenting voices, and they have systems and traditions in place to address disagreement and dissenting voices. Now, some of those traditions might seem violent and antiquated to us looking out, like the thing that happened with Jamis when he challenged him and they was like, okay, well, y'all have to fight to the death. You can say that, but like that, those systems were in place so that people had a way to speak up when they disagreed with the decisions made by authority figures. And he completely violates that the second that he goes into that meeting at the end, and they tell him, they're like, you're not supposed to speak here unless you are the leader. And in order to be the leader, he would have to kill Stilgar. Now, I understand not wanting to murder Stilgar. That is your friend. I'm not necessarily saying that he should have done that. But what he then does is he uses what he has been saying this entire time was manipulation. He's been calling the use of the prophecy by the Bene Gesserit manipulative and predatory, essentially. Maybe not in so many words, but he's been implying that the entire film, saying that he knows that it's being wielded against them, that they are being made to see things because of what's being told to them. And in the end, he wields that to completely override their values of equality to take over as this powerful figure. And to me, that whole scene felt, even if it wasn't physically violent, you know, it wasn't violent in the same way that it would have been if he had to kill Stilgar. But honestly, in a way, it was kind of worse because Stilgar was telling him, I am willing. Like, he was telling him, like, I am willing.
So it wouldn't be something brutal.
To sacrifice my life. Now, even that is because of what he has been manipulated to believe.
Sure, yeah.
But he then sort of forces, it's a violation. Like, he forces his way into these people's minds and, like, airs out their personal, you know what I mean? Like their personal lives in order to get them to comply and obey and believe in him.
And he's using fear throughout that entire time.
During that final battle scene against, like with the Fremen going up against the Harkonnen, I had very conflicting feelings during that scene. Because, like, there is a sense of, like, triumph, like, seeing them finally take down the Harkonnen, who have been especially after what they do to their, like, compound. It is, like, very satisfying to see them defeat them. But as the fight continues, you see how it, even visually, becomes less and less about the Fremen at all. Because they become less and less visible in everything happening, right? Like the initial scenes of the battle are like, you're seeing the Fremen people and like their, you know, quote unquote desert power, like really in action. Like you're seeing how they are able to take on the Harkonnen because they're obviously indigenous to this planet and they understand and they can utilize its resources in a way that the Harkonnen can't. But as the battle goes on, especially when they get into that courtroom, it's not about the Fremen at all. Like at that point, it is so obviously about his personal vendetta and his personal revenge. And so it really begs the question of like, what is he fighting for?
Yeah.
Because I think he told himself and told the Fremen and made them believe also like via the prophecy that they'd been fed that he was fighting for the Fremen. But in the end, it's obvious that he's not, because nothing that he's doing in those last few scenes has anything to do with them. And like you were saying, like, it's not liberation. Like, I think the first thing I said when the movie was done, I was like, that's not liberation, that's assimilation. Like, you're assimilating them into this imperialist culture. The question is never asked in the film, like,
what do they want?
What does liberation look like to the Fremen people? But we know from the film prior that being involved in the imperialist politics and system was at best something that they were just disinterested in.
Yeah.
Because when they're offered that sort of leaf from Leto, he sort of turns it down. He's kind of like, I'm not really that interested at first. And then he sort of like reluctantly agrees, or tentative. I can't remember the exact thing they agreed to. It was kind of like a tentative, like, we'll see. But they don't seem interested at all in being invested or involved in the politics of the empire.
Yeah.
But that's exactly what Paul does. And you just know that what's going to end up happening is that they're going to end up being his foot soldiers as he takes on all these other houses, all these other things. And it's like, I don't think the Fremen ever really had any real stake or interest in any of that.
Nah.
I think, honestly, they would have just liked to be left alone.
Well, you know that they didn't, because when the Harkonnens came, and Duncan, Idaho, asked that lady, I forget what her name is, the black character in the first one, when he's sort of saying like, yo, the emperor left us here to die. And then she responds, it's essentially like,
that's not our problem.
That's not our fight. That's not our problem. So that already gives you an indication that they don't have interest in the politics that's sort of existing in their world.
It was very conflicting to me because it was like, yes, it's satisfying, but I didn't have that sense of triumph because I was like, I think even if I didn't know where the films were going to go after this,
yeah,
I still think even within this film alone, there is enough, it's problematic enough to feel a sense of unease at how this is ending and what the Fremen's involvement will be in this moving forward.
Yeah. I think the unease we're feeling about the decision that Paul's making in exploiting the Fremen, the film makes you feel that through Zendaya's character in Shadi.
Yeah.
I genuinely believe, outside of Paul, obviously, you could argue she is the most important person in this story. In the first film, the first voice that we really, I mean, obviously we hear the sound of the Harkonnens, but like the first narrator we really hear is from Chadi's perspective. And then she goes on this monologue about what they've been enduring. And then she says, Harkonnen have left. She says, who will our next oppressors be? And then who is the next person that Denis Villeneuve shows in the next shot in the film? It goes straight to Paul. And that is the most on the nose, straightforward tell of this is who you need to be concerned about. And that becomes more alive in the second film as what Shadi is sort of seeing Paul do, because she can understand the repercussions of it. And what makes it very interesting is when she talks to Paul's mom and she sort of wishes her good fortune in the war, she says like, I'm not doing it for that. I'm doing it for my people. Like, that's who I'm fighting for. Her moral compass is as clear as day, and she is a constant reminder of how you're supposed to interpret this war. You're supposed to differentiate liberating against this oppressive structure in the Harkonnen, but knowing that you're not supposed to weaponize this through that prophecy. And that becomes more of a reminder throughout the entire film through her character. Because in that final scene, like, she walks away and it's a reminder of like, yeah, wait, this is not, you're not supposed to feel good about this.
I think it's so important that people do not mistake her decision at the end as she was heartbroken because he chose to marry the emperor.
It's part of it.
I think that was like an extra sting on top of it, but I think she would have left regardless because she was so staunchly against what he was doing from the beginning. If I'm remembering correctly, which like we wanted to see the film again today, which would have helped, but if I'm remembering correctly, where we really see like a change in his decision making
once he drinks it,
it's no, because first he had to decide to even go there and drink
yeah.
It's not right when Gurney arrives, but it's after the Harkonnen attack the compound. And then it's like, okay, like I have to, and then he's like, okay, I'm going south, and he's reluctant about it, but like he goes straight to the temple and drinks the stuff. Like he's like, he goes through with every single step. I honestly think what happened, because I was trying to work through this, I was like, okay, did the poison like change his mind? Like what, you know, I think that would rob the story a little bit of what it's trying to say, because it would make it seem like it was like not his fault, you know? I honestly think what happened is when the Harkonnen attacked the Fremen compound, I think it reminded him and was the same type of hurt that he felt when they attacked the Atreides house. And I think those two, that happening allowed him in his mind to like conflate the two causes into one and tell himself that he could fight for both of them at the same time by doing the same thing. Like, I think it made him feel that going through with what his mom wanted and what Gurney wanted and all of this stuff was like two birds with one stone, because he was feeling the same thing. Before he was like, my desire to hurt the Harkonnen, that is my desire for personal revenge for what they did to my family. Yeah. But the second that the Harkonnen attacked the way that they did and violated this new home that he had found, then it was like that desire for revenge was for both. So I think it allowed him to buy into that without having to feel like he was abandoning the cause. I remember like after we saw the first movie, I read up a lot and I realized like what the commentary was meant to be, but I also found that like the series has been co-opted by some like far-right racist groups of people as like their own personal like white savior is whatever, right? And watching this film, I see how that can happen. If you already have those preconceived biases and ideas, you're going to see the Atreides culture as superior. Like you're going to see that culture of that type of hierarchy, that type of power structure as superior. So in the end, when he basically like saves all the Fremen and then like brings them into this system, you're not going to feel that sense of like unease that you and I felt watching it. Yeah. And without reading the books, I can't necessarily say if that's on any like the fault of Frank Herbert. I don't know if there's anything that he could have done better to make it more clear. I haven't read the books. I don't really know. But I think like it's just always the danger when you tell these stories from the perspective of the oppressor. The audience that most needs to hear it is not going to sympathize with who you are intending for them to sympathize with. I'll be interested to watch the conversation around this franchise as like, and I'm sure a lot of these conversations were already being had like when the books first came out. I will not be surprised if what we see people saying is, well, like number one, which we already saw this in the comment section of our last video, like, well, spice is like it's like an absolutely necessary resource, right? So like there was already like some justification happening of like, well, like without this resource, like it all falls apart. So like they have to do this. And two, I think we'll see it as like a greater good, like you're making bad decisions for the greater good. Yeah. I would not be surprised if we see some of that, if we see people being like, I mean, yeah, like it's kind of manipulative or whatever, but like in the end, like the Fremen, you know, Paul led them to victory. Like he, you know, like that's what I think will happen. I don't know if there's blame to place. I don't know if there was a way around it. I just think like,
well, I think
that's going to happen.
I think it comes down to the point that he was trying to make. I think the point that Herbert was trying to make is not about the conclusion about this holy war and what Paul does. It's about how you're led to these points. What led the story to that, and the charisma behind a character, you know, like a very ecstatic person. Like when Paul gives that speech, he's showing a lot of charisma there. He's swaying the opinions of these people. All of the decisions leading up in terms of the dangers of religious sort of manipulation in that prophecy and unchecked power. All of that happening and existing over a period of time is going to lead to situations where you only have bad choices. Focusing on the war isn't really where I think Herbert wants you to focus on. It's about what led you to this sort of impossible choice.
I think it's a little bit about both. Because I think the ultimate conclusion, even in this film, is not ideal, personally. Sure. I am just saying, I think that people's preconceived biases going in is going to impact their ability to pick up on that.
Yeah. I agree.
I just like,
and I don't know if that's not Herbert's fault.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
You know what I mean?
I don't know. Like, again, I haven't read them. It's just always the risk that you have when you tell stories from this angle. And I'm not saying that stories shouldn't be told from this perspective. I just think like it's just always something at play.
And with that, thank you all so much for tuning in, and we will see you all next time. Take care, everyone. Peace.